So we were talking about the strengths, the weaknesses of the SEC, and you were emphasizing the disclosure-based regulation. That was the fundamental underpinnings of the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Commission has, and as we go along, we can talk about each of the different areas. I think they each fit together in a relatively seamless way that reinforces themselves. But in many ways, the disclosure principles that are administered in the corporation finance division, but the offerings that are made by issuers and the continuous disclosures reflect a core value of the Commission in transparency and sunlight. And we always used to talk about Justice Brandeis and his famous quote that sunlight is the best disinfectant and is better than other forms of oversight, because something that's out on the table for everyone to see, the problems can't hide. And that really is the bread and butter of one major component of the Commission, that dedication to the value system that America as a democracy should not have its capital markets or its corporate system behind closed doors. It should be open, it should be visible to the people who, I mean, at that time there were probably 50 million Americans owning stock, and what goes on in those corporations and in those capital markets should be visible to the country, and that's our best protection against capitalism's greatest enemy, which is corruption. Capitalist systems can deliver standards of living beyond any other system yet tried on the planet, but they are vulnerable to crony capitalism and market principles being tamped down and replaced by collusion. And it is the SEC's job to see that, though that may happen in China, or it may happen in Peru, or it may happen wherever, that it doesn't happen in the United States of America. And that's a mission that has inspired the people who walk through the door at the SEC since 1934 and remains critical today. It is, you are the firemen, you are the protectors of that openness.
Let's talk about when you walked through the door at the
Yes.
SEC. Did you go into it thinking that you would develop an agenda of some sort, come up with a plan, or was it much more of a reactive experience?
Oh, I think any government job is in part reactive. You kind of can't tell the world to just stop while you do what you're planning to do. So that's inherent in things. But I had a pretty good idea of things I wanted to accomplish, things I had seen. Remember, I used to do an IPO all day long, every day, 6 days a week, going to the printers till 4 and 5 in the morning, every night of the week. So I had a very good, I had done, when I was first or second year in private practice, I did the largest self-tender share buyback in the history of the United States. I had worked on, this was the very early birth of the hostile M&A movement, and I had been very much involved in my New York law practice in that. So the Williams Act and the M&A world and the IPO world and the offerings practice were things that I knew extremely well and had seen at very close range and understood the importance of them. Things like the trading rules that govern execution of orders on the New York floor of the New York Stock Exchange, I hadn't dealt with in practice, but I was certainly well versed in transactional side of practice, and in that sense, I suppose historically it sets me apart from many chairmen who come to the SEC with a background in litigation and enforcement. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, I thought enforcement was really important, a critical part of the SEC's capabilities and what enables it to deliver on its mission. But my background wasn't suing people and putting them in jail. My background was helping people raise capital, and that was what I had a pretty significant focus on. Also, international transactions. When I was in my first year of private practice, I had one client that was negotiating a joint venture between a small company in upstate New York and a giant state-owned French company to try and develop a new technology. And I worked on a little high-tech American company that was developing plants in Northern Ireland with the assistance from the EU. I had done projects in Japan. I'd done projects here. So I had seen in my New York law practice, I tried to collect loans the banks had made to Iran. I had seen international capital markets such as they were in the 1970s when I was practicing law, developing, and I knew that the commission wasn't ready for it. And the commission had been in a domestic mind warp because there were almost no foreign companies really traded here. There were ADRs and there were token listings, but big industrial companies from around the world were not coming here to do primary offerings and raise capital, but I felt it was pretty likely they would. Remember, I lived through the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the final stages of the Cold War and this cataclysmic global transformation where 40–50% of the population of the world went from being under socialist economies to market-based economies. So, you know, these forces were coming on the market. Technology was enabling things that had never been done before. We'd gone from, in almost every area. So the impact on the commission of those forces was such, I thought, that so when I was coming in, one of my principal focuses was to make sure that the commission addressed itself to these kinds of forces. And
right.
I remember when you are nominated for a job that requires Senate confirmation, you have a series of briefings with the staff to prepare you for your confirmation hearings, because you'll get asked very detailed questions about this rule and that rule, and do you agree with this or do you not agree with that? So I had a briefing session with each of the commission's divisions that would last a couple hours before my confirmation hearing. And I made it a point in every one of those sessions to begin asking them questions about the international aspects of their program. Because I knew that the first briefing that happened, all the other division directors would be in that division director's office 5 minutes after I walked out the door saying, what's he like, what's he interested in, what were the questions like, how did he do, what was it like, to help prepare them. And I wanted them each to say, well, you better be ready to answer what we're doing about international markets and international capital flows, because he's really interested in that. So that was another area of focus. So, but in almost every area, I had areas that I thought could be improved. And
well, let's talk about the creation of the Office of International Affairs, because that was a fairly early initiative that you took.
it was indeed.
Yeah. You've discussed the fact that you were interested in this. You'd been following all these years. You'd seen the collapse of the wall. What was the challenge of getting this new entity up and running within the commission?
Leadership. It was not hard. If I said it was going to happen, it was going to happen. I mean, yes, I would have to get buy-in from the other commissioners, but organizing the divisions is not something that you would normally anticipate having a struggle among the commissioners on. And several of my commissioners had were similarly interested in the international side of things. But the commission, when I got there, I started trying to inform myself as deeply and thoroughly as I could on the state of play in international issues and what the commission had been doing and what it could do. And the starting point was those briefings that in advance of my confirmation hearing. And then once I arrived at the commission, that became a constant focus. And so it became clear that that there was an immense, as I knew when I came in, there was an immense amount of work to be done. And in the late 80s, you'd had a series of high-profile insider trading prosecutions, Ivan Boesky and Jeffrey Siegel, and a large number of cases. And one of the big early insider trading cases that had become very noteworthy was one involving trading by an American on inside information that had been run through accounts in Bahamian banks and then on to Beirut. Usually they went through Beirut, back to Paris, then to the Bahamas again, and eventually, but you had somebody sitting in the United States using the mails, using telephones, using jurisdictional means to conduct trading in New York on the basis of illegal information, unlawful activity, but routing that to avoid detection through other countries. So I knew that was an issue. And more broadly, a number of other sort of policy issues between the U.S. and trading partners around the world. So,
had there been any memorandums of understanding created before you came in?
yes, so the Memorandum of Understanding is a unique device of a treaty light, a document that the parties intend or promise each other they will obey as if it is a treaty, but it isn't a treaty because that requires majority vote by the U.S. Senate, and that's hard to get. Plus, agencies like the SEC are not allowed to negotiate treaties. The State Department does that. So there had been in these cases, and one of the big ones and most pivotal ones, this is before I became chairman, involved trading in Santa Fe Industries that was financed by persons in Kuwait. And you had a number of big cases, controversial. And the SEC had started to work in its normal way of piece by piece to find a way to make things happen. And there was an individual on the SEC staff named Michael Mann who became indispensable to me as my first director of the Office of International Affairs. And Michael was working in the enforcement division. And his career had evolved from a very early time in his career at the Commission to negotiating these information sharing problems between the U.S. and Switzerland, between the U.S. and Britain, involving the Kuwaitis, and I think there was interest in the part of some countries in not becoming pariahs, and particularly Switzerland was very interesting and pivotal because of the role of Swiss bank secrecy. But under Swiss law, the bank secrecy does not extend to condoning criminal activities. And so you had the desire as a competitive matter to have bank secrecy, but not to be seen as a haven for criminality. And I think Michael's oral history is one people should read and refer to because he's the master of these things. But Santa Fe gave a lot of impetus in the U.S. The SEC worked out an early deal with Switzerland that Michael and I later elevated and improved considerably. And there were one or two others. The Brits might have done something. There might have been an early one with Japan. But there were two or three of these MOUs. But it was not at all widespread, just selective. And of course, the bad guys had figured out that, well, this is an easy way to throw the SEC off the scent. And there was still huge insider trading cases going on. And, this is the era of Goldman Sachs partner being walked off the trading floor in handcuffs. The level of controversy over some of the big insider trading cases. And so it was essential for us to be able to get information about American people who had committed crimes or illegal acts in the U.S., but had used international borders to try and cloak what they were doing. And in return, we were certainly happy to try and provide reciprocal help. Turned out we didn't initially have the statutory authority to do that, but we later got it.
When did you get it?
I don't remember, but we got it.
It was during your chairmanship?
Yes, I'm pretty sure. But we would have cooperated anyway, as best we could. There were some technical glitches in every country on both sides. This was something that hadn't been done before. Michael had developed the model, the template, and had been the steady hand at the commission pushing it forward, but the world really didn't. You couldn't walk into somebody's office and ask them what they thought about MOUs. They say, MOUs about what? But we had the guy. He had developed the model. It was needed by the times. And so, but there he was, buried in the bureaucracy of the enforcement division. And I said, well, what's up with that? And so to me, it was very clear that since I had so many international issues I wanted to pursue, and I felt the commission fundamentally needed to be as involved globally as it would be domestically, that we needed an office, a division that would focus on international matters, not as a byproduct of other things they were doing, not when they would get around to it, but from morning to night every day. And that was a controversial decision within the commission. Linda Quinn, who then headed corporation finance, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known, bless her soul. It's a national tragedy when Linda passed away. I think she would have been a future SEC chairman and had so much to contribute. It was a personal and national loss that we lost Linda at such a young age. But Linda then running Corp Fin, and the enforcement folks, market reg, they didn't usually agree on very much, but they all agreed Michael should not be a division director. It wasn't because of Michael, it was just because they didn't want to have to negotiate with a peer. It was much easier to keep this international program under control if it was buried in somebody's department. Well, that conversation didn't last very long. I just told them they didn't have a vote on that question, and really, I probably put it more nicely than that, but that they had a certain amount of time to figure it out. And Michael is he probably would hate to hear me say this, but he's really an exceptionally talented diplomat, and understood the importance of having the International Affairs Division born out of consensus rather than out of controversy. And there was plenty of work to do, and he didn't need to steal anybody's turf. He needed to just be able to work one-on-one directly with me. I was insistent that he was going to be a direct report to me, not through someone else. And we got it done. And this worked extremely well, and the office was very, very busy. I think we signed 18 MOUs while I was chairman, and 8 or 9 or 10 technical assistance agreements. I don't remember the exact number, but we not only wanted to exchange information with established markets, but we wanted to use our knowledge and expertise to help emerging markets that wanted to pursue larger and more robust capital markets, to help them do so. So we offered to have technical assistance as part of our package of things we did in working with different countries. And what Britain needs is very different, which they didn't think they needed anything from us, which was fine, and it's very different from what Poland needs, or the Czech Republic, or Hungary. So we did both, and Michael proved very versatile in building a program that would handle both MOUs and technical assistance. And then later, we layered on the International Institute, which I created, and is still running to this day. I'm not quite sure why they haven't named it after me since I created it, but poor judgment, I guess, or oversight perhaps. But anyway, we created it, and it was Michael and I trying to decide how we could best help. We had simultaneously dozens and dozens of countries that were liberated from socialist economies. And literally, okay, the Russian army just left. Now what do we do? Well, we now want to start rebuilding the economies throughout Eastern Europe. They wanted to rebuild, but they hadn't had market economies or anything remotely. Sometimes even before the Soviet era, they hadn't had much of what we would recognize as a market economy. But yet that was the direction the world had turned. The Cold War was over. It was time to have a market economy. People would call up, can you help us get a market? And I used to joke that, maybe DARPA, which was the black box guys over at the Pentagon, could develop for me and air something that could be deployed by a C-130 that would have a market in a box, and you can push it out on a parachute and it would land, and would have a probe that would go out searching for an electric connection, and a satellite dish that would self-deploy, like a lunar lander, and that we would say, okay, there's your stock market. We dropped it in the jungle over here. But no, seriously, people were, I make light of it, but there was a thirst, a real genuine thirst. It was a exciting time, because minds that had been focused by the Cold War for a half century, all of a sudden, were all free. It's kind of the mindset. And broadly speaking in the world, there were two models of capitalist structures: universal banking of the Germans, or the American public capital markets. And I had a distinct idea and preference of which system other countries should adopt, in their interest as well as in ours. But universal banking is simpler to understand. You have one big bank, you subsidize it, it monopolizes things, and there's your system. And versus this capital market, this fractious, and you've got all these different kinds of firms and all this activity, and how do you control this? So we wanted in the Institute to create a mechanism for helping countries and market authorities, so either people running a stock exchange or in a Ministry of Finance or an SEC, to share with them the techniques that the SEC uses to regulate a capital market. And so we set up the school to run for 2 weeks, and our first session, we didn't know who to invite. It had never been done before. And so Michael and I noodled over that for quite a while. We finally decided we would send a letter to the U.S. ambassador in all the countries that we thought would be interested or might be interested. And we would also send a letter to the finance minister in those countries, and in some cases to the head of the central bank. And we would tell them that we were going to hold this school for 2 weeks. We would help people who came get internships in U.S. private sector firms for another 2 weeks if they wanted. and here it was, and here are the dates, and you're invited. Well, we had no idea whether anyone would come. Obviously, there was no track record, and we didn't even know whether we were reaching the right people or not. And so I had some anxious moments wondering whether we would have the inaugural session and nobody would be sitting in the audience. And Michael came in one day and told me that I asked him how it was going, and he said, well, we have a major problem. I said, what is it? He said, well, we only have 95 chairs in the meeting room, and we've got 120 requests to come, and they're still coming in. And so we discovered that there was quite a thirst for what we were preparing to offer. And it was a lot of work to take the division directors and the senior staff and really have them focus on, because they all give speeches to groups of lawyers constantly. But it's really how to focus that on people who have a baby market that's just developing, and how to help equip both the regulatory side and the market side with the challenges that are going to come your way. And so it was a wonderful success the first year, and then every year the attendance grew, and we had to figure out how to get more chairs and more people in the room. But it's been a wonderful example of, I felt from the first day I was involved to today, that the SEC has an immense amount that it can share of knowledge to share with the world, because we've spent 85 years figuring out the tricky problems.
You mentioned that other divisions had some involvement in international things as well. One of the things I thought was interesting was Reg S and 144A, both of which were important to internationalization on a broader scale. Those seem to have been in the works when you got there, but
lots of things were in the works when I got there.
What did it take to get those two things to happen?
I don't much remember on Reg S. I mean, Reg S was a very complicated reg, hopefully useful. Linda Quinn said we should do it. That was kind of enough for me, but I looked at it a little more than that. But Reg 144A, on the other hand, I was deeply involved in. The staff had been developing, Linda and her team had been developing that, and a simple principle. The SEC had, for decades, provided private offering exemptions, but things that were sold in a private placement could never be then traded by that purchaser. So if New York Life bought a privately placed notes or bonds from General Motors, they had to hold them. And unless the company came in and registered them later on, they pretty much had to hold to term or sell them back to the company at a discount or something else. So naturally, those buyers would demand a premium return for that illiquidity. And the Corp Fin concept that Linda had built into 144A was a perfectly logical extension of those decades of work of the SEC defining what could be privately placed without the registration protections of the 33 Act. And it then said, well, if you're a qualified institutional purchaser of a private placement, and you're New York Life and you bought these General Motors bonds, if MetLife wants to buy them from you, that's fine. You're both quibs, you're both qualified buyers, and why would the SEC care if one insurance company trades it to another as you're managing their liquidities? And so I didn't think it was a particularly, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to see the logic of it. Where you had to be careful and thoughtful was in constructing the rule and making sure, and the commission staff, and Corp Fin in particular, is always careful when they're creating a door to let some people out of the prospectus requirements, that the door, they know exactly how big the door is and that it not turn out to be something that could be abused. And I think I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know when the first draft of the rule came to me, the concept was great, made perfect sense. I thought it was too small. I thought they were so worried about the door being too big that there were only 3 or 4 qualified institutional buyers in the world, and there were, you could only sell this trade something that was 5 million in size or something. And so, I broadened the rule and the exemption in every direction, consistent with the principles, but I just told Linda, if we're going to do this, let's be bold, not timid. And so I went to the commissioners and we talked, and there was, I think, unanimity. Maybe one person against it, I don't remember, but very broad support. And so we did it, and it's worked. Trillions and trillions of dollars have been issued under 144A at lower cost, and not just at lower cost in registration, but at lower cost to issuers. It's making the capital markets more efficient, because if you give people liquidity, then they don't have to demand an illiquidity premium.
One last thing on the topic of internationalization, and that's Iosco. It appears that you were involved with that organization as well during your time.
That's putting it very, very mildly. Well, Iosco was the International Organization of Securities Commissions, then headquartered in Montreal, I believe, and it had, and I suppose Montreal, because one of the very close relationships in the securities regulatory world was between the SEC and the Canadian regulators, and particularly with Quebec and Ontario. Had some issues with British Columbia and penny stocks, but we had very, very close relations, particularly with Ontario and the Toronto Exchange, but also with Quebec. And we developed and implemented what we called multi-jurisdictional disclosure that allowed the Canadian companies to issue in the U.S. with using only their Canadian documents, because their requirements were so closely paralleled on ours, and they agreed to vice versa. And anyway, the U.S.-Canadian relationship had been strong, and you had in Iosco originally, you had the SEC, the Canadian regulators, and then a mixed a group of other countries that had major markets, but the membership in Iosco was mixed. So the Swiss originally were represented by the Swiss Bankers Association, and the Germans had a representative that was a private sector German group that later became the German banking regulator. In the UK, they were going through a period where they changed who their regulator was about every 6 months, every 18 months, but I mean, it was constant change. They had Big Bang and Little Bang and medium-sized Bang, and they constantly changed who their regulator was, but the British regulator in its different incarnations was there. It was the Securities and Investment Board. While I was chairman, headed by Sir David Walker, who was a great friend and terrific individual, which I was very close to. We had good cooperation. They had the Japanese Ministry of Finance, so the equivalent of the U.S. Treasury for Japan. So the composition of the membership was different. Iosco had functioned as a meeting place where regulators got to know one another personally, and one should never underestimate the importance of that, because then when you need to do something, it's not just a name or not just a voice on the other end of a phone. But it hadn't really done much of substance. By contrast, over on the banking side, you had what had once been called the Cook Committee for Peter Cook from the Bank of England, who chaired it, and then later became known as the Basel Banking Committee. But the central banks had made an industry out of their committee that cooperated. In fact, a good friend of mine, David Mullins, who became vice chair of the Fed, was at Treasury when we were doing the thrift bill and then became vice chair of the Fed. And his wife worked as a staff member for me, and we were very close friends. And David would describe his monthly trip to Basel to, sit and coordinate. And frankly, I thought the securities community needed something much more homogeneous that was regulators only, not where you could talk about supervisory issues and enforcement issues, and you can't do that if there's a trade association in the room. And so that we needed to help Iosco evolve into something more like the institutional capabilities that existed in banking. And Michael Mann, again, was instrumental in that, in helping. We offered, one of the first changes was I began going to the Iosco meetings personally. And that hadn't typically been the case, and that automatically upped the game and upped the ante and encouraged counterparts who wanted to spend time with the chairman of the SEC to come as well. And so I started going, and then we offered to do a study for the group of Iosco and how it operated and see if we could recommend improvements. And Michael and his team wrote a terrific study that essentially proposed to take something called the technical committee and build it into a model of what existed in Basel, as close as we could get. Not trying to do what in banking, they actually go to adopting global rules, which is probably a topic for another day, but I thought was a very bad idea generally because they become inflexible. They're so hard. It takes you 10 years to negotiate them, and then when the market changes in 3 months, it takes you another 10 years to adjust your rules, and you can never catch up. But common principles were, I thought, vital. And they were missing across the board. I mean, insider trading was illegal in the United States. It was a national sport in several of the countries that were in the technical committee in those days. By the time I left, it was pretty much illegal in every one of those countries. But we succeeded in persuading the members of Iosco to really invest intellectual capital into the work of Iosco. And they saw that it could be a bridge between the European Commission and the US, and that it was a nice meeting place without any framework at the outset of compulsory rules. It would just be a place to exchange dialogue, exchange studies, and the serious people in the commissions all over the major markets could get together and have a program of work. I think we did a standard on MOUs that helped open the door for more and more and more MOUs and what should be in them, what shouldn't, and the principles underlying that. Linda Quinn pulled off a worldwide agreement on global auditing standards. Accounting standards was controversial, but we were able to agree on what auditing standards should be on a global basis, and almost every market adopted. So we got some tremendous results, dividends out of the work at Iosco.
Terrific. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up for today.